It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in a packed Los Angeles courtroom, the kind of day that would quickly fade into memory for most people. The kind of day that usually revolved around legal jargon, standard procedures, and lawyers who thought they had seen it all. But then, the doors swung open, and Clint Eastwood walked in. His entrance was calm, almost deliberate. Wearing a tailored suit, his silver hair a sharp contrast to the youthful energy of the younger attorneys seated in the room, Clint walked to the front like a man who knew the gravity of the situation. He had the poise of someone used to being on the other side of a camera, where every movement was scrutinized and analyzed. Today, however, there was no film crew. No cameras to capture this moment. Just the quiet hum of a room full of people who had no idea what they were about to witness. The judge, a man in his late 50s named Judge Horace Dugan, glanced up from the papers in front of him as Clint stood before him. His brow furrowed for a second, processing the unfamiliar face before giving a small, almost apologetic smile. He glanced at the defense attorney, who was shifting nervously in his chair. The judge sighed, shaking his head. Well, Judge Dugan said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Looks like we've got ourselves a movie star in the courtroom. You planning on directing the case, Mr. Eastwood? A light chuckle rippled through the gallery, and Clint stood still, expression unreadable. He wasn't there to play a role. He wasn't there to make an entrance. He wasn't even there for the case itself, at least not entirely. His eyes narrowed for just a moment, his gaze cutting through the laughter as though it never existed. I'm here to testify, Clint replied, his voice low and measured, with that familiar gravelly tone that had echoed through theaters for decades. There was a stillness to him, a calm that seemed to freeze the room, but Judge Dugan wasn't done. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. Testify? Well, I hope you're not here to give us some cowboy wisdom, Mr. Eastwood, Dugan said with a chuckle. We're in a court of law, not a Western movie set. The truth is, I'm not sure how you can help us here. Clint remained composed, not a muscle twitching. He had been in this position before. The world had underestimated him once or twice, but he didn't mind it. In fact, he was used to it. After all, Clint Eastwood had lived 1,000 lives in the public eye, from a soldier to an actor, from a director to a former U.S. Secret Service agent. But that wasn't why he was here. He was here because the case that had been filed against him threatened something far more personal than anything else he had faced in the public arena. I think you'll find my testimony is exactly what's needed, Clint replied, his gaze unwavering. His voice held no threat, just quiet confidence. There was a brief pause before the judge gave him a long, hard stare. I'm sure we'll get to that, Mr. Eastwood, Judge Dugan said, his tone beginning to shift. But I can't imagine a man like you gets involved in something like this without a reason. Let's not waste time with unnecessary theatrics. The judge was still smirking, but Clint wasn't fazed. He wasn't there to entertain. He wasn't there to charm anyone. He was there to see this through. And then, something strange happened. The judge made a joke, perhaps to keep things light, or perhaps just to be dismissive of Clint's serious nature. Okay, Mr. Eastwood, I'll bite, Judge Dugan continued with a small laugh. Tell me, what would you do if you were in my shoes? And, for the sake of this, let's pretend you're the one on trial. A smirk tugged at the corner of Clint's mouth, but it wasn't humorous. It was calculated, a flicker of something deeper. Something the judge didn't notice. The audience, though, caught on to the change in Clint's demeanor. There was something unsettling about the quiet tension in the air. Clint took a small step forward, his gaze turning just a fraction colder. If I were in your shoes, Judge, Clint said softly, his voice lowering to a near whisper, I would be very careful about who I make fun of. The words hung in the air. The courtroom went silent for a moment. Even the judge seemed caught off guard. It wasn't the usual reply he expected. Most people would laugh it off, maybe apologize for their lightheartedness. But Clint was different. He wasn't trying to get laughs. He wasn't trying to get applause. And it became clear to everyone in that room that Clint wasn't playing by the usual rules. That's when it happened. The change. The moment that sent the entire courtroom into a state of shock. Clint reached into his jacket pocket slowly, pulling out something that glittered in the light, a badge. Not just any badge, but a U.S. Secret Service badge. The same badge that had once carried him through some of the most dangerous situations in the country. The same badge that had ensured the safety of politicians, dignitaries, and presidents. Clint didn't say anything. He simply showed the badge to the judge. No words, no threats. Just the silent, chilling reality of who he was. Judge Dugan's face drained of color. The room, which had been filled with hushed laughter only moments before, now felt like a vacuum. No one moved. No one breathed. For a few seconds, the only sound was the soft scrape of the judge's chair as he shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glued to the badge. The weight of Clint's presence settled over the room like a thick fog, and everyone knew that something had shifted. The judge's voice trembled slightly as he cleared his throat. Mr. Eastwood. I wasn't aware. Clint didn't let him finish. His gaze was fixed, unyielding. You should be, he replied simply, before turning and addressing the room, his voice steady but unrelenting. I'm not here to joke. I'm here for something much bigger than any of you realize. The judge swallowed hard, the earlier humor evaporating. The tension in the room had skyrocketed in an instant. Whatever Clint had come for, it was clear now that the courtroom was no longer the ordinary setting for a mundane legal proceeding. It had just become something far more dangerous. And no one knew it yet, but they were all about to be swept up in the storm Clint had brought with him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The room remained tense as Clint Eastwood stood there, his U.S. Secret Service badge gleaming in his hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that sent ripples of shock through the courtroom. The judge had no choice but to swallow his pride and step back, literally and figuratively, as the gravity of the situation hit him. For the first time in what felt like forever, the powerful man in the black robe found himself out of his depth. The silence that followed Clint's revelation was deafening. The audience, the lawyers, the bailiffs, they all waited with bated breath. But Clint, ever the stoic figure, did not rush to fill the void. He stood still, looking down at the badge in his hand, as if reflecting on a long and storied past that no one in this room could fully comprehend. Clint wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just a director. He wasn't even just a celebrity. Clint Eastwood was, and still was, a man of many lives. The silver-haired icon was also a former U.S. Secret Service agent who had spent years protecting the highest-ranking officials in the country. He had been trained to handle dangerous situations, navigate complex political environments, and solve crises that others couldn't even begin to understand. But those years had shaped him in ways no one could guess, and Clint hadn't shared the full scope of his life's work with the public, until now. The judge cleared his throat nervously, trying to regain some control. Mr. Eastwood, he began, his voice shaky, I didn't know you were involved with. I don't like to talk about it, Clint interrupted. His voice was quieter than before but still firm. Some things stay in the past. I did what I had to do. Now I'm here because I need to settle something personal. Clint's gaze was now directed at the floor in front of him, as though he was lost in a memory. The audience could feel it. The weight of the past, the ghosts of the people he had protected, and the dangerous situations he had found himself in. Clint Eastwood hadn't always been in the public eye. Before the fame and fortune, before the movie sets and directors' chairs, Clint had served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. It was there, in the heat of battle, that Clint had first been exposed to the harsh realities of life. But it wasn't just the war that shaped him, it was his ability to stay calm in the face of chaos, to keep his emotions under control when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. After his time in the military, Clint transitioned into law enforcement, taking on roles that would eventually lead him to the U.S. Secret Service. His time with the service was not filled with glamorous assignments or heroic tales of saving presidents. Instead, Clint found himself in the trenches, working behind the scenes to ensure the safety of the nation's most vulnerable. It was a job that required complete discretion, dedication, and a level of professionalism that most people would never understand. But Clint thrived in that world. He learned how to blend into the background, how to read people's intentions before they even spoke, how to spot danger from a mile away. As the years passed, he became one of the agency's top agents, tasked with some of the most sensitive and high-stakes operations. And yet, for all the action and danger, Clint's heart remained detached from it all. He learned how to compartmentalize his feelings, how to focus solely on the task at hand. He became a machine, efficient, methodical, and unyielding. But underneath that exterior, there was a man who carried the weight of countless secrets, some of which still haunted him to this day. One of the hardest things Clint ever had to face in his life was a mission that went terribly wrong. It was a mission that still haunted him, despite the years that had passed. He had been assigned to protect a foreign dignitary, a man whose life was constantly under threat due to political unrest. Clint was the best agent for the job, cool-headed, reliable, and relentless in his commitment to the mission. But even the best plans could go awry. The attack came without warning. A bomb detonated just a few feet away from Clint and his charge, throwing them both to the ground. Clint managed to shield the dignitary from the blast, but not everyone made it out alive. The explosion claimed the lives of several members of the security detail, and the trauma of the event would stay with Clint forever. In the aftermath, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He knew he had done his duty, but the emotional toll of that day weighed heavily on him. The responsibility of those lives lost, the families left behind, it all lingered in the back of his mind. The guilt didn't go away. That was when Clint started to pull away from the Secret Service. He began to question everything he had worked for, everything he had given up for the job. His connections to people grew distant. His personal life, once vibrant, began to deteriorate. He couldn't keep doing it. It wasn't just the loss, it was the knowledge that he could never go back to the person he had been before that day. That's when Clint decided to leave the Secret Service. But walking away from a life like that was not easy. He had seen too much, experienced too much, and once you'd been that close to the world of power and danger, there was no going back. His life after the Secret Service would never be the same, but Clint moved forward, his resolve hardening with each passing day. When Clint Eastwood returned to Hollywood, it wasn't just for the sake of a career, it was an escape. After years of protecting those who lived in the highest echelons of society, Clint was looking for something else. He took on roles that played to his strengths, stoic, silent, and capable of doing things no one else could. Movies like Dirty Harry and The Good, The Bad and the Ugly resonated with audiences because they showed the side of Clint that few ever saw. The strong, silent man who had been forged in the fires of war and Secret Service work, now battling the demons of his past while bringing justice to the screen. But Clint's true motivations were more complex than just fame. He was looking for redemption, searching for a way to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was trying to become. The world saw the tough guy on screen, the man who could do no wrong. But Clint Eastwood knew better than anyone that the real battles were the ones that raged silently in the mind. Now, decades later, Clint found himself back in a courtroom, no longer a film set, but the same cold, unforgiving place he had spent so many years avoiding. And though the world may have laughed at the idea of Clint Eastwood being in this position, no one could have known that he had come here for a very different reason. He wasn't just a man seeking justice, he was a man trying to make peace with a past that could never be erased. The judge, having seen the brief flash of vulnerability in Clint's eyes, seemed to take a step back, not just physically but emotionally. The room seemed to understand that Clint was not a man to be dismissed, not a figure to be mocked. This was something far greater than a celebrity cameo. This was a man who had lived a life filled with loss, pain, and sacrifice. The judge cleared his throat, finally coming to terms with the weight of the moment. "I understand, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice softening. "Let's proceed, then. But I think we all know there's more to this than meets the eye." And with that, the courtroom began to settle, the tension slowly fading, but the shadow of Clint Eastwood's past continued to hang over them all. The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Clint Eastwood's quiet yet intense presence seemed to cast a shadow over the room. The judge had finally regained some composure, but Clint could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It wasn't just the badge that unsettled Judge Dugan, it was the quiet, unwavering resolve that Clint exuded. This wasn't the typical courtroom drama. There was something far more personal at play here, and Clint's reputation as a man of action was more than enough to prove that. As Clint stood silently before the judge, his thoughts wandered to the moment that had brought him here, the moment he had been dreading for years. It was a moment when something far more dangerous than just a courtroom case came into focus. The threat against him, against the people he cared about, had escalated. His past had come knocking, and it wasn't something he could easily shake off. The defense attorney, a younger man named Jason Turner, fidgeted nervously in his seat. He had heard rumors about Clint's past, about his time with the Secret Service, but he hadn't expected the man to be so unyielding. And now, Jason was beginning to realize that this wasn't a simple case. This wasn't going to be a straightforward courtroom exchange. Clint glanced at Jason, catching his eye for a brief moment. The lawyer swallowed hard, clearly realizing that Clint wasn't just a movie star with a badge. He was someone who had seen things, done things, and now was involved in something far beyond their control. Something far darker. The case before the court seemed simple at first, a civil lawsuit involving a dispute over land ownership. On the surface, it was just another case about property lines and legal documents. But as Clint sat there, he knew it wasn't just about property. It was about something much more dangerous. The land in question had once belonged to a powerful family, a family with ties to the political elite. It was a plot of land that had been passed down through generations, but over the years, it had become a contested area, with developers eyeing it for commercial use. Clint had no interest in the land itself, but he had a personal stake in the people who were involved. Clint's old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Richards, had been one of the key witnesses in the case. Michael had been a former military colleague and one of the few men Clint had trusted during his time with the Secret Service. When Michael had reached out to Clint, asking for help in a case that was far from ordinary, Clint had agreed without hesitation. But now, as Clint sat in the courtroom, the stakes were much higher than he had anticipated. The land was more than just land, it held secrets. Secrets tied to a covert operation that Clint had been part of years ago, something that had been kept buried to protect the people involved. But now, someone was trying to expose it. Someone knew what had happened and was using the case to bring it all to light. The land dispute was merely a cover for something far more sinister, and Clint was at the center of it. As the proceedings continued, Clint's mind raced. He had been prepared for a simple lawsuit, but he wasn't prepared for the unexpected turn the case was about to take. When Jason Turner finally stood to present his opening arguments, his words seemed to strike a chord in Clint's memory. "This case is not just about ownership," Jason began, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "This is about accountability. This is about the people who have used their power and influence to manipulate the system and take what isn't theirs. And we intend to expose that." The words hung in the air, sending a ripple of unease through the room. Clint's eyes narrowed. It was clear now that Jason wasn't just talking about land ownership. He was alluding to something far more dangerous, a cover-up that went all the way to the top. Clint's instincts kicked in. He had been trained to spot threats, to see through the smoke and mirrors of power plays and deception. This wasn't a case about land, it was about power, corruption, and a conspiracy that could unravel everything Clint had worked to protect. And now, someone was using this lawsuit to bring it all to the surface. Clint leaned forward slightly, his face stoic, but his mind was racing. He had to act fast. The stakes were higher than he had realized, and the enemies he had once faced in the shadows were now coming for him in the most public of ways. As the hearing continued, Clint's thoughts turned to Michael Richards, his old friend, who had been dragged into this mess. Michael had been a part of the covert operation years ago, and now he was a key witness in this case. If Michael was exposed, it would not only destroy his career but also put his family in danger. Clint couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let it happen. But the more Clint thought about it, the more he realized that Michael wasn't the only one at risk. He was, too. The people he had protected, the lives he had touched, all of them were in danger now. The secrets that had been kept hidden for so long were now coming to light, and there was no telling who else might be involved in the conspiracy. Clint's past had come back to haunt him, and the people he cared about were caught in the crossfire. The danger wasn't just looming, it was right here, in the courtroom, in the faces of the lawyers, the judge, and the witnesses. And Clint had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Clint could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle undercurrent of fear that had begun to grip everyone in the room. The case wasn't just about land anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about a conspiracy that had been buried for years, something that threatened to shake the foundations of the very system Clint had once sworn to protect. When Judge Dugan called for a short recess, Clint stood up, his movements deliberate, and walked to the side of the room. He needed a moment to clear his head, to think. But as he stepped into the hallway, he was met by someone he didn't expect, someone who knew far too much about his past. Mr. Eastwood, the voice came from behind him, smooth and almost too casual. Clint turned to see a familiar face, an old contact from his time with the Secret Service, someone who had long since disappeared from his life. "Don't play games with me, Clint," the man said, his tone darkening. "You're in over your head. This case is bigger than you think. And you're going to regret getting involved." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this man was working for, but one thing was clear, whoever it was, they had their sights set on Clint and the people he cared about. The secret they were all keeping, the one buried so deep, was about to come to light. And Clint knew that once it did, there would be no going back. Clint Eastwood stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the courtroom, his eyes locked onto the man who had appeared out of nowhere. The shock of seeing his old contact, someone who had disappeared from Clint's life years ago, sent a cold shiver down his spine. The man's words echoed in Clint's mind like a warning bell. "You're in over your head." Clint didn't flinch. He had been through countless dangerous situations, life-or-death moments that required quick thinking and even quicker action. This time was no different. But the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. This wasn't just about a case anymore. This was about a conspiracy that reached into the darkest corners of power, a web of corruption that threatened everything Clint had worked for. "Who are you working for?" Clint's voice was steady, but there was an underlying edge of urgency. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. His old contact was dangerous, and Clint knew it. There were no coincidences in this world. Not anymore. The man smirked, his eyes glinting with a mix of familiarity and something darker. "Does it matter? You already know too much. If you keep digging, Clint, you'll find yourself buried with the rest of us." Clint took a slow step forward, his movements calculated. "I don't plan on being buried," he said, the resolve in his voice unwavering. "And if you think I'm going to back down, you're mistaken." The man's smirk faded as he took a step back, his face darkening. "You should have stayed out of this, Clint. The people behind this, they don't care who you are. They'll take down anyone who gets in their way." Clint's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly who this man was talking about, the shadowy figures lurking behind the curtain of the legal system, people who had their hands in everything, from politics to business to covert operations. People who had no qualms about eliminating anyone who threatened their power. And Clint had just become their target. Clint turned on his heel and walked back into the courtroom, his mind racing. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still gaps, and Clint knew they were dangerous gaps. He had seen corruption up close during his time with the Secret Service, but this felt different. This wasn't just about keeping a president safe or protecting the country's interests. This was personal. As Clint made his way back to his seat, he caught the gaze of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Richards, who was sitting at the defense table. Michael gave him a small nod, one that Clint understood all too well. It was a signal, a warning, maybe. Clint couldn't be sure. But it confirmed something he had suspected all along. Michael was involved in this case in ways that Clint had not yet uncovered. And if he wasn't careful, Michael might be dragged into this nightmare too. Clint leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the judge. Judge Dugan was trying to maintain control of the proceedings, but even he couldn't shake the sense that things were spiraling out of control. Clint could feel it in the air, something was coming. He didn't know what, but he knew it wasn't good. The court recessed for the day, and Clint found himself walking through the crowded hallways of the courthouse, his mind still reeling. As he stepped outside into the crisp evening air, he was met by his lawyer, Marissa Hill, who had been representing him in the case. "Clint," Marissa said, her voice low and tense. "We need to talk. This isn't just a land dispute anymore. There's something bigger going on here. I've been looking into the documents, and I've found discrepancies, things that don't add up." Clint stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. "What kind of discrepancies?" "I don't know yet, but they're related to a set of accounts, offshore accounts, to be specific," she continued, her voice full of concern. "And those accounts are linked to several high-profile individuals. People who have connections to both the government and the private sector." Clint's heart sank. He had feared this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made it feel all the more real. This wasn't just a few corrupt people trying to get away with something small, it was a full-scale operation, one that reached deep into the core of power. "Who's involved?" Clint asked, his voice sharp. Marissa hesitated before speaking again. "I think we're looking at a network of people who have been using their influence to control major assets and manipulate legal proceedings. And the land in question, it's just a small part of a much larger puzzle." Clint clenched his jaw. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it spelled out made it all the more dangerous. This wasn't just about stopping one criminal or protecting one man. This was about dismantling an entire system of corruption, and Clint had just become its target. That night, Clint lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced, replaying everything that had happened since he had walked into the courtroom. The warnings from his old contact, the subtle threats, the pieces of the puzzle that were just out of reach, it was all coming together, but Clint didn't have the luxury of time. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Hello." The voice on the other end was familiar, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. "Frank," Clint said, his voice steady but urgent. "I need your help. Something's going down, and I can't do this alone." Frank's voice softened. "You should have stayed out of this, Clint. You don't know what you're getting into." "I don't have a choice," Clint replied, his tone resolute. "I'm already in it, and so are people I care about. I need you to dig into the people behind this, find out who's pulling the strings." There was a long pause before Frank spoke again. "I'll see what I can do. But be careful. This goes deeper than you think. And once you start digging, you can't stop." Clint hung up the phone, his mind swirling with thoughts of the coming days. He knew that whatever was coming next, it would require everything he had, every skill he had honed over the years in the service of others. This was a fight for survival, and Clint wasn't going to back down. Not now. As the days passed, the situation grew more dangerous. Clint's movements were monitored, his every step watched. The courtroom drama continued, but now it was more than just legal proceedings, it was a battlefield, and Clint was at the center of it. With each passing hour, the walls seemed to close in. Clint knew that the people behind this conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to back down. He had spent his life facing down danger, and this was no different. He would fight, not just for himself, but for the truth. And as the case loomed closer to its conclusion, Clint could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. Clint Eastwood stood outside the courthouse, his face expressionless but his mind far from calm. The weight of the case had shifted from a legal battle to something far more personal. Every decision he made from here on out would affect not only him but the lives of those around him. He had already learned that the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined, and his worst fears were beginning to manifest. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Marissa. "Clint, meet me at the diner on Main. We need to talk. It's urgent." Clint's heart skipped a beat. The tension in his chest tightened as he read the message again. Urgent. Those were words he hadn't wanted to hear. Marissa had been a reliable ally throughout this mess, but he could sense that something was changing. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The truth was no longer a simple matter, it was a weapon. And the people who had orchestrated this plot were not people you wanted to cross. Clint arrived at the diner, his mind racing as he pulled into the empty parking lot. It was late, and the neon lights of the diner flickered in the cool night air. He stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming as he entered. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night patrons hunched over their coffee cups. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights mixed with the soft sound of a jukebox playing in the corner. Marissa was sitting in a booth, her back to the door. She looked up as Clint approached, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He could tell something was off, and the sight of her drained expression sent a pang of unease through him. "Clint," Marissa greeted him, her voice a mix of urgency and fear. "I found something. Something big." Clint sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Marissa leaned in closer, her eyes darting around the diner as if making sure no one was listening. "I've been digging into the people involved in this case, and I think I've uncovered something that could blow the whole thing wide open. The land dispute, the hidden accounts, those were just the beginning. Clint, the people behind this aren't just corrupt businessmen. They're connected to high-ranking officials. People in the government, people with power, people who have been orchestrating illegal activities for years." Clint's jaw clenched as the words sunk in. He had suspected there was more to this than just a corrupt land deal, but hearing it from Marissa made it all too real. The conspiracy was deeper, far-reaching, and involved people Clint had once trusted. "But that's not the worst part," Marissa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know we're on to them. And they're already making moves. I don't know how, but they've been tracking us." "You." Marissa stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening with horror. Clint instinctively reached for his jacket, his hand brushing against the concealed weapon holstered underneath. He knew what was coming before she could finish her thought. From the shadows of the diner, a figure stepped forward, his silhouette cutting through the dim light. It was Frank, the man Clint had called earlier, the old contact from his past. But Frank didn't look like the man Clint had known. He looked different, colder, more calculating. His face was set in a grim expression, and in his hand was a folder, thick with documents. "Clint," Frank said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying threat. "You should have listened to me." Clint's heart dropped. Frank's sudden appearance was no accident. This wasn't a friendly visit, it was a warning. And it hit like a punch to the gut. You've been digging into things you shouldn't have, Frank continued, his eyes locking onto Clint's with cold intensity. And now you're putting everyone at risk. You've already set things in motion that you can't stop. People are watching, Clint. You've made a mistake. Clint stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he did. What do you mean, Frank? Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings? Frank didn't flinch, but there was something almost sad in his eyes. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're not. This isn't just about a land deal. This is about protecting a system that has been in place for decades. People you've trusted are part of it, Clint. You've always been too blind to see it. Clint's pulse quickened. You're saying that this, he gestured around them, as if to encompass everything, the case, the people involved, the lies, is bigger than I thought. But why bring me into this? What do you want? Frank opened the folder, sliding it across the table to Clint. You need to see this, he said. This is where it all started. The documents I have, everything you've uncovered, it's part of a much bigger plan. They'll destroy you, Clint. And they'll do it without blinking an eye. Clint hesitated but reached for the folder, his hand steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He flipped through the papers, his mind racing as he processed the information. Each document confirmed his worst fears, the conspiracy was real. And it wasn't just some isolated corruption. It was a carefully orchestrated operation to control, manipulate, and eliminate those who posed a threat. Clint's eyes fell on a particular name, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a name he recognized, someone he thought was long out of the picture. Someone who had been involved in his past in ways Clint had tried to forget. This can't be right, Clint muttered, his voice barely a whisper. How could they? Frank cut him off, his face grim. You were just a pawn, Clint. And now you're in too deep. Clint stood there, staring at the documents, his mind spinning. Every revelation, every twist and turn, had led to this moment, the moment when he realized he was no longer just a man fighting for justice. He was a man fighting for his life. Suddenly, the diner door slammed open, and Clint's heart lurched. Two men entered, their faces hidden by dark glasses and hats. One of them walked directly toward their booth, his movements deliberate and menacing. The other stood guard near the door, watching every movement, every exit. Clint's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. The world seemed to slow as the tension in the room mounted. This was it, the moment everything would come to a head. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. As the man approached, he pulled out a gun. Clint, he said, his voice cold. We have unfinished business. The world around Clint seemed to explode into chaos. The gun in the man's hand glinted ominously under the dim diner lights, and Clint's heart raced as he instinctively positioned himself closer to the edge of the booth. His hand was already hovering near his holster. He had been in situations like this before, he knew the drill, knew that one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the truth, for justice, for the people he cared about. The man who approached him was unrecognizable in his dark attire, but Clint could feel the weight of history in the air. He had seen men like this before, men who followed orders without questioning the cost. Men who served the powers that be, no matter how corrupt or dangerous. But Clint wasn't about to let them pull the strings any longer. Clint Eastwood, the man sneered, his voice smooth but dripping with disdain. You always did have a way of getting yourself into trouble. Clint didn't flinch. Who are you? He asked, his voice steady, though the adrenaline was pumping through his veins like a current of electricity. He needed answers, needed to understand who was behind this attack, but the man's face remained blank, emotionless. I'm just the messenger, the man replied, his smirk never faltering. But you won't be alive long enough to care about the details. Clint's instincts took over. In one swift motion, He drew his gun and aimed it at the man's chest, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the heat in his blood. You don't get to decide that. The diner fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with tension as everyone held their breath. The man's hand twitched toward his own weapon, but Clint was faster. With a flick of his wrist, the gunshot rang out, echoing through the small space like a thunderclap. But as the man crumpled to the floor, Clint realized something wasn't right. There had been no sound of struggle, no fight, nothing that would indicate a real threat. It was too easy. It was all too easy. Clint's eyes scanned the room, his mind racing. The man on the floor was down, but the real danger had yet to reveal itself. And then, from the corner of the diner, someone stepped forward. Someone Clint had hoped he'd never see again. Marissa. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She was holding a small, black pistol in her hand, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Clint's heart skipped a beat as he met her gaze, confusion and betrayal flooding through him. Marissa? Clint said, his voice low. What the hell are you doing? Marissa's lips trembled as she lowered the gun. Clint, I didn't want to. I never meant for any of this. But they told me I had to. Clint's stomach dropped. This wasn't just some mistake. This wasn't some misunderstanding. Marissa had been playing a role in all of this, and Clint had been too blind to see it. She had been part of the conspiracy all along. I didn't have a choice, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I thought you were safe, but they're watching me. They're watching us all. They said if I didn't help them, they'd hurt you. Clint's mind raced as he processed her words. It was a confession, but it was also a plea for help. Marissa had been trapped, manipulated by forces far beyond her control. He could see it now, she was just another pawn in this deadly game. But it didn't make the betrayal sting any less. Who are they, Marissa? Clint demanded, his voice firm. Who's behind all of this? She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, then back to Clint. She knew the risks of saying too much, but she couldn't keep running anymore. It's bigger than you think, Clint. The people behind this, they're not just businessmen or politicians. They're connected to the highest levels of power. The kind of power that has the resources to make anyone disappear. They've got their hands in everything, Clint. They've got everyone. The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Clint had known the conspiracy was deep, but hearing it from someone so close, someone he had trusted, made it all the more dangerous. They had eyes everywhere. They had control over every aspect of his life, and now they were coming for him. Clint, they're coming for you, Marissa continued, her voice breaking as she stepped closer to him. You need to leave. Now. I've bought you some time, but I can't help you anymore. You need to get out of here. Clint shook his head, disbelief creeping into his voice. What are you talking about? I'm not leaving without you. Marissa's face hardened, her resolve clear. You have no choice. If you stay, you'll die. And so will I. You're too important now, Clint. You can still bring them down, but you have to survive. Please, do this for me. For the first time in a long while, Clint felt the weight of something other than his own survival. He had lost so much already, his career, his reputation, his peace of mind. But Marissa. Marissa had been part of his fight for justice, and now she was giving him one last chance to finish what he had started. Clint swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. I won't forget this, Marissa. You've got to trust me on this. You'll be okay. I'll be fine, she whispered, her voice trembling. But you won't be if you don't leave. Please, Clint, just go. Clint hesitated one last time before turning and sprinting out the back exit of the diner. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As he ran into the night, the cold wind slapping his face, he felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. Marissa's betrayal still stung, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. Clint had always known that in a fight for justice, there would be sacrifices. But this was something different. It was personal. And as he disappeared into the shadows, he made a promise to himself, a promise to see this through, no matter what it took. The night air was sharp and cold as Clint moved quickly through the back alley, his boots echoing off the wet pavement. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, his mind whirling with the gravity of everything he had just learned. The truth was finally coming into focus, but it was also more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. The conspiracy was deeper than he had feared, and now he was a target, a man on the run. His breath came out in ragged bursts as he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see shadows following him. The diner's parking lot was behind him, quiet and still. But Clint knew better than to trust the silence. Every step he took was another step into the unknown, into a world where allies were scarce and trust even scarcer. The memories of Marissa's warning rang in his ears. "They're coming for you." And he could feel it, the weight of being hunted, of knowing that every decision could be his last. The people behind this, whoever they were powerful and ruthless. They weren't just after the land or the money, they were after him. Clint didn't know who exactly he was fighting against, but he knew he couldn't afford to stop now. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed safety. He wasn't sure where to go or who to trust anymore. The only thing he could do was keep moving. He had to stay ahead of them. Clint ducked into the first shadowy corner he found, pulling his phone from his pocket with shaky hands. He scrolled through the contacts list, pausing on the name, Tommy. He didn't want to involve anyone, but he had no choice. Tommy was the kind of guy who knew how to disappear, how to get people out of sticky situations like this one. The phone rang 3 times before Tommy picked up. "Clint. What the hell, man? Where have you been?" Tommy's voice was gruff, but Clint could hear the concern laced through it. "Tommy, listen to me," Clint cut him off, keeping his voice low. "I'm in trouble. Big trouble. I need you to get me out of here. I need a safe place, somewhere no one can find me." Tommy paused for a moment, the line crackling with static. "What kind of trouble? And who's after you?" Clint closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. "I don't have time to explain everything. It's complicated. Just know that there are people after me, and they'll do anything to make sure I'm out of the picture. I need a place to lay low. Can you help me?" There was a long pause before Tommy spoke again, his voice low. "You're asking a lot, Clint. This isn't a game anymore. These people, whoever they are, they're serious. And I don't want to get caught up in it." Clint didn't have time to convince Tommy with words. He had to make it clear that this wasn't a choice, it was survival. "If you don't help me, Tommy, I'm as good as dead. I'm not asking for much. Just get me out of here, and I'll figure out the rest. I'll owe you, man. Big time." Tommy sighed heavily, then muttered, "All right, fine. But you owe me one, Clint. This is going to get ugly." "Just tell me where to go," Clint said urgently. "You remember that cabin up in the mountains? The one we used to go to for weekends away?" Tommy's voice was hesitant but resolute. "Go there. I'll send you the details. Don't trust anyone else, Clint. Stay low." Clint felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. He had a place to go, but time was running out. The chase had already begun. "I'm on my way," Clint replied before hanging up the phone. Clint didn't waste another second. He knew the cabin Tommy mentioned, nestled deep in the mountains, hidden away from civilization. It wasn't the most comfortable place, but it was safe. At least, it had been the last time he'd been there. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. If he let his guard down for even a moment, he'd be caught, and that would be the end of everything. As he moved through the city streets, Clint kept to the shadows, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. He knew better than to be seen. Every car that passed, every figure in the distance, was a potential threat. He wasn't sure who was tracking him, but he could feel the weight of their gaze, watching, waiting for the right moment to close in. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Clint pushed through the exhaustion, forced himself to ignore the hunger gnawing at his stomach, the ache in his legs. He had no choice. He had to keep moving. The cabin was at least 3 hours away by car, but Clint had no intention of taking the main roads. He couldn't risk being seen or followed. As he reached the outskirts of the city, he found an old, abandoned car lot. Clint took a quick glance around to make sure the coast was clear, then slipped inside, hotwiring a dusty sedan parked toward the back. It wasn't ideal, but it would do the job. Once he was behind the wheel, he sped off, heading for the winding mountain roads. The drive was slow and treacherous, the car struggling to handle the rough terrain. But Clint didn't care. He just needed to get to the cabin, to get somewhere safe before it was too late. The sun was starting to rise as Clint neared the base of the mountains. The first light of dawn barely touched the peaks, casting long shadows over the winding path ahead. Clint's eyes were heavy, but he couldn't afford to fall asleep. He had to stay sharp. The danger was far from over. Then, just as he rounded a sharp curve in the road, he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path. Clint's heart slammed into his chest, and he slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches from the person. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, standing perfectly still, her face obscured by the shadows of her hood. Clint's instincts screamed at him to drive away, to get out of there before it was too late. But something stopped him. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and she stepped forward, slowly. Clint's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Clint Eastwood," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "You've been running for a long time. But the chase is almost over." Clint didn't know who this woman was, but one thing was clear, she wasn't here to help. Clint's heart pounded as he stared at the woman standing in the road. Her presence was an eerie stillness amidst the motionless morning, the pale light of dawn barely illuminating her features. There was something about her that felt wrong. Like she was too calm, too composed for a world that had just thrown Clint into chaos. The chill in the air seemed to freeze the moment, and for a heartbeat, Clint wasn't sure if she was real or some twisted manifestation of his paranoia. "Get out of the way," Clint's voice was low but steady, his hand inching toward the car's ignition again. He wasn't about to let anyone block his escape. The woman didn't move. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, her dark eyes locked on his with an intensity that sent a shiver down Clint's spine. "You think you can outrun this, Clint?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the cold morning air. "You think that running will save you?" Clint's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His instincts told him to floor the gas pedal and drive straight through her, but something about her presence kept him rooted in place. She knew who he was. More importantly, she seemed to know what he had been running from. "Who are you?" Clint demanded, his voice growing more forceful. "What do you want with me?" The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the one who's been watching you, Clint. I'm the one who knows what you've done, and I'm the one who'll ensure that you don't make it out of this alive." Clint's pulse quickened. "I'm not scared of you." "Oh, but you should be," she whispered, her voice hauntingly calm. "The people you're running from, they're not just after you. They're after everyone you've ever cared about. And if you think you can protect them by running, well, you're wrong." Clint's mind raced. This wasn't just some random threat. She wasn't speaking in vague generalities. She knew his fears. His vulnerabilities. She was connected to the forces chasing him. And now, she was here, in the middle of nowhere, making sure that his escape would be nothing but a dream. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Clint muttered, trying to muster a semblance of calm, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. "You have no idea who you're working for." The woman's gaze darkened, her lips pulling into a thin line. "I know exactly who I'm working for," she said, her voice colder than before. "But you're too stubborn to understand. You think you can fight this alone, Clint, but it's already too late. You've already lost." Her words hit harder than any punch, and Clint felt the sting of reality creeping in. The people behind this, whoever they were, weren't just threats in the background. They were everywhere. They had their eyes on every move he made. And now, they were bringing the full force of their control right to his doorstep. Suddenly, the woman stepped back, tilting her head slightly. Clint's eyes narrowed as she made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Run, Clint," she said, her voice laced with a mocking sweetness. "But know this, you won't be running forever." Before Clint could react, she turned, disappearing into the misty morning, as silently as she had arrived. Clint's mind was a storm of thoughts, his body frozen in place for a moment too long. He didn't know whether to chase after her, demand more answers, or get back on the road. But one thing was clear, this was no ordinary threat. And the more he resisted, the more the net around him tightened. Clint shook off the unsettling encounter as best as he could and drove on, the tires of the sedan crunching on the gravel as he ascended higher into the mountains. The dense trees on either side of the road were dark and forbidding, their gnarled branches twisting like hands reaching for him. The woman's words still echoed in his mind, though. "You've already lost." Clint gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the accelerator. He couldn't afford to stop now. He couldn't afford to doubt himself. He had one goal in mind, the cabin. A safe place. A place where he could regroup, figure out his next move. But as he neared the turnoff to the cabin, his senses were on high alert. Something didn't feel right. The cabin had been Tommy's safe house, and Clint had used it for years as a place to lay low. But now it felt like a trap. Clint slowed the car, his fingers tightening around the wheel as he scanned the area. No sign of anyone. No obvious movement. But his instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. He parked the car off the main road, cutting the engine. He sat in silence for a moment, listening to the mountain air, the soft rustling of trees, the faint distant sound of birds. But then, something caught his eye. A shadow moving swiftly in the distance. Clint's heart dropped. Someone was out there, watching him. They had found him. Clint opened the door of the car slowly, making sure not to make a sound. He moved with purpose, stepping lightly onto the gravel and heading toward the woods that bordered the cabin's property. His training kicked in. Every step was calculated. Every sense was heightened. He had to stay one step ahead of whoever was following him. He moved carefully through the woods, blending in with the shadows, the trees offering some cover. The cabin was still a few hundred yards away, but the closer he got, the more he could feel the presence behind him, someone, or something, tracking his every move. Then, the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. Clint's body tensed, and he spun around just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure disappearing behind a tree. Damn it! He had no choice now. There was no way he was walking into that cabin unprepared. He crouched low, making his way through the trees, angling toward the cabin from a different side. Whoever was following him clearly knew the terrain well. Clint needed to be smarter. He needed to be quicker. Just as Clint reached the cabin, he froze. In the dim light through the window, he saw movement. Someone was inside. His heart skipped a beat. Was Tommy inside? Or was it someone else? He slowly crept closer to the window, peering inside. His eyes widened when he recognized the figure standing in the center of the cabin, a familiar face, someone he hadn't seen in years. Tommy. But Tommy wasn't alone. Standing beside him was none other than the woman from the road. Clint's breath caught in his throat as he pressed his back to the side of the cabin, his mind racing. He had just stumbled upon a nightmare scenario. Tommy, the one person he thought he could trust in this mess, was inside the cabin, but so was the woman, the one who had warned him on the road. The one who had said, "You've already lost." What was going on? Why was Tommy involved with her? Was he just another pawn in this dangerous game? Clint's hand tightened around the handle of the gun tucked into his waistband, but he hesitated. He couldn't storm in there guns blazing, not when there were so many unknowns. Clint slowly crouched down, inching closer to the window. He needed to see what was going on. He needed answers. His heart was pounding, every nerve on edge, but he couldn't afford to be reckless. Not now. Through the cracked glass, Clint could see the two figures inside. Tommy was sitting on one of the old chairs, his hands resting on his knees, looking uneasy. The woman, however, stood with her back to Clint, staring out the window, seemingly unaware of his presence outside. "Tommy," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "You know what happens if he doesn't show up. We can't let this drag on any longer." Tommy shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know what you want from me. I'm just trying to keep him alive. You can't." The woman cut him off with a sharp gesture, turning toward Tommy with a steely expression. "I didn't ask for your protection. I asked you to deliver. And you're running out of time." Clint's stomach churned. The woman wasn't just a threat to him. She was playing a dangerous game with Tommy too. Clint had to step in, and he had to do it now. Clint quickly backed away from the window, his mind whirling. He needed to figure out how to handle this, but his options were growing slim. If Tommy was involved with the woman, did that mean his loyalty had shifted? Was he working against Clint now? No. Clint couldn't believe that. Not after everything they'd been through. But something was wrong. Tommy had always been a straight shooter. If he was in on this with the woman, there had to be a reason, a bigger picture Clint couldn't see yet. Clint pulled himself together and began to circle the cabin, keeping as quiet as possible. The back door was his best option, it would give him a direct line to Tommy without the woman seeing him first. He checked his gun again, making sure it was ready. He moved quickly and silently, pushing open the door just enough to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. Clint's senses were on high alert as he crept through the living room. His eyes scanned the cabin, focusing on Tommy, who was still sitting in that chair, his face drawn tight with worry. "Clint," Tommy said softly, his eyes widening as he noticed him standing just inside the door. His voice was filled with surprise, but there was also a hint of guilt. "What are you doing here?" Clint didn't give Tommy a chance to respond further. "I need answers," Clint snapped, his voice low and demanding. "Now." The woman at the window turned around quickly, her gaze locking onto Clint with a deadly calm. For a moment, Clint felt as though he was caught in the gaze of a predator. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I was starting to think you were too smart to walk into this trap." Clint felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. "What is this?" he asked, his voice firm but with an edge of desperation. "What's going on here?" Tommy stood up slowly, his face conflicted. "Clint, listen. I didn't." "Don't lie to me," Clint interrupted, stepping closer. "What she got on you? Why are you helping her?" Tommy's eyes flickered to the woman, then back to Clint. "I'm not helping her. I never wanted any of this." The woman laughed, a low, mocking sound. "Oh, please. You can't pretend you're not involved now. You've known what we've been after this whole time, Tommy. You knew this would happen." Clint's pulse quickened. "What is she talking about?" he demanded. Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't have a choice, Clint. This is bigger than both of us. You've got to understand, I never meant for you to get caught up in this. Clint's mind was spinning. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined, and now Tommy was admitting that he had been involved in something dangerous, something that Clint couldn't even fully grasp. But one thing was clear, Tommy wasn't his enemy. Not yet. The woman, however, was a different story. You don't have a choice, Clint, she said coldly. None of us do. The game's already started, and you're already losing. Clint's gaze narrowed. What do you mean? What game? Her smile was sharp, predatory. I'm afraid you don't get to know that just yet. But you will. You'll understand soon enough. She turned toward Tommy again, her tone more forceful. Get him out of here. If he stays, it's over for all of us. Tommy hesitated, looking from Clint to the woman, his face a mask of frustration. Clint, you've got to trust me. This isn't what it looks like. Just leave with me. We can get you out of here. Clint shook his head. I'm not leaving without answers. I need to know who I'm fighting, Tommy. I need to know everything. The woman let out a small, cruel laugh. You're still asking questions. How quaint. She took a step toward Clint. You've been running from the wrong people, Clint. The ones pulling the strings, they don't care about your fight. They don't care about you. And if you're not careful, they'll make sure you don't make it out alive. Clint's heart sank. He could feel the walls closing in. Whoever this woman was, whoever the people she worked for were, they had plans for him. And those plans didn't include survival. Clint stood frozen, the weight of the woman's words pressing heavily on his chest. They don't care about you. The words echoed through his mind like a hammer striking stone, each beat of his pulse a reminder of the gravity of the situation. His eyes darted between the woman and Tommy, trying to piece together what was happening, but the fragments of information refused to form a clear picture. Tommy's face was twisted in guilt, but there was something more there, fear. It wasn't just about what Clint had been through. It was something Tommy had been carrying, something that Clint had never expected. I didn't think they'd come for you, Clint, Tommy said, his voice cracking with the weight of what he was confessing. Not like this. I thought I could keep you safe. I thought I could stop them. The woman smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort Tommy was showing. You didn't stop anything. You were just delaying the inevitable. Clint's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, trying to remain calm, though the rising tide of frustration was beginning to claw at his resolve. Who are you? Who are they? What's the game you're playing here? The woman didn't answer at first. She tilted her head, studying him with an unnerving stillness. Then, slowly, she said, the ones pulling the strings aren't who you think they are. They're not just some shadowy organization. They're everywhere, Clint. And they don't stop. They've been watching you for a long time. Clint's mind reeled. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice rising with the pressure building inside him. She didn't flinch. I don't need anything from you. You're just a small part of something much bigger. But you can't run forever. That's the thing you still don't get. Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. And neither can Tommy. Tommy looked away, unable to meet Clint's eyes. The guilt was consuming him, and Clint could see it, the betrayal he had tried to ignore, the signs he had refused to acknowledge. The truth was settling in like ice water in his veins, cold and unforgiving. You lied to me, Clint said, his voice low and edged with disbelief. You knew about all of this. You knew what was coming, and you let me walk right into it. All of it, the threats, the men following me. Everything. Tommy shook his head, the burden of his own guilt crushing him. Clint, I didn't have a choice. I thought I could protect you. I thought I could keep them away. The woman's smile was thin, almost mocking. Protection, Tommy. That's cute. You're fooling yourself. He was never meant to be protected. Not by you, not by anyone. The moment you walked into this, Clint, you were already marked. They knew everything about you. The moment you got involved with the wrong people, you lost. Clint took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. He wasn't sure if it was the fear or the realization that Tommy had known more than he had let on, but the betrayal stung like a knife twisting in his side. His trust had been shattered, and now, he was left standing in the ruins of it all. No, Clint said, shaking his head, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fury. I don't believe that. I don't believe that I've lost. I'm still here. And I'm not going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The woman's gaze softened just a fraction. It was the faintest shift, but Clint noticed it. You don't understand, she said, almost as if she was speaking to a child. It's not about whether you believe it or not. It's about what's already been set in motion. You can't stop this. None of you can. The game's already in play, Clint. And it's too late for you to change the rules. For a moment, the cabin felt suffocating. The air grew thick, and Clint could almost hear the ticking of an unseen clock counting down the moments he had left to make a decision. He had no more time to question the woman's words, no more time to stand in the shadows of doubt. He had to act. He had to push past the fear, the uncertainty, and the anger that threatened to swallow him whole. You're wrong, Clint said, his voice stronger now. I haven't lost yet. And I won't. Not while I still have a breath left in me. The woman's eyes flickered, just for a second, and then she nodded slowly, as if accepting Clint's defiance as an inevitability. You think this is about your survival? You think this is about you winning? Her smile grew colder, more knowing. No. This is about something much bigger than you. Bigger than all of us. Clint swallowed hard, trying to steel himself against the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But in that moment, he realized something: the woman wasn't just a threat. She was a messenger. The ones behind her weren't after him for petty reasons. They had plans for him, for all of them. And if he didn't find a way to stop them, everything he'd fought for would be lost. Then tell me what I need to do, Clint said, his voice steady now, his eyes locked on the woman's. Tell me how I stop this. For the first time, the woman's expression shifted. She seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether or not to reveal the truth to him. Then, slowly, she spoke. You can't stop it. But you can make a choice. You can choose to play their game, or you can choose to die trying to change the outcome. Clint's heart thundered in his chest, his mind racing. What are you saying? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't just about survival. It's about control. And right now, Clint, you're out of time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint could feel the cold weight of the woman's words lingering in the air as she slowly backed away, her smile as sharp as ever. It was like she'd thrown a gauntlet at his feet and dared him to pick it up. And that's exactly what he was going to do. The silence that followed was suffocating, every breath feeling like it was strangling him. Tommy was still standing there, his face a portrait of misery and regret. Clint's gaze flicked back and forth between Tommy and the woman. Neither of them seemed to know how to move next, but Clint's mind was made up. The clock was ticking. He couldn't afford to let fear or hesitation dictate his next move. You're right about one thing, Clint finally spoke, his voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside him. I'm not going to die trying to play someone else's game. The woman's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained her composure. It's already in motion, Clint. You don't get to choose when this ends. Clint stepped forward, his boots scraping against the floorboards, the sound echoing like a battle cry. I'm not asking for permission. I'm taking my shot. The woman's eyes narrowed. You think you can just walk away from this? Think again. Clint didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to Tommy, who was still standing motionless, too paralyzed by his own fear to act. We need to get out of here, Clint said, his voice cold and commanding. Now. Tommy's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but then he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. I'll explain everything. But we have to move fast. They'll be on us soon. The words didn't comfort Clint. He had learned a long time ago that the people who said, "They'll be on us soon," weren't always just speaking in metaphor. With no more time to waste, Clint grabbed Tommy by the shoulder and urged him toward the door. The woman watched them with a cold intensity, her expression unreadable. As they passed her, she didn't say another word, but Clint could feel her eyes on him, burning into the back of his skull. The moment Clint stepped outside, the night air hit him like a slap to the face. It was crisp, cold, and unforgiving, and Clint took in a deep breath, the harshness of it sharpening his senses. He had no idea what kind of mess he was walking into, but he wasn't going to let fear drive him anymore. He'd been fighting his whole life, but this felt different. This was something bigger than he was, something that had been set in motion long before his arrival. And yet, here he was, still standing, still fighting. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Where are we going? Tommy asked, his voice trembling, more out of exhaustion than fear. Clint didn't hesitate. We need to get to the safe house. The one we talked about, near the old mill. Tommy nodded quickly. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Clint didn't answer. There wasn't time for small talk. There wasn't time for much of anything. He moved quickly, scanning their surroundings, knowing full well that they were being watched. He could feel the weight of every shadow, the tension in the air like a powder keg waiting to explode. Tommy followed closely behind, but Clint could tell he wasn't entirely sure of the plan. Hell, Clint wasn't sure of the plan either. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in this place, couldn't keep hiding in the shadows of a game he didn't even understand. They reached the truck in what felt like an eternity, Clint's hand instinctively going to the door handle. But as he swung the door open, he heard a faint sound, a distant hum. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. We're not alone, Clint muttered under his breath, already reaching for the gun at his waist. Tommy froze, his eyes wide. What do we do now? Clint's mind raced. They weren't going to outrun whoever was coming for them, not this time. And the worst part? He didn't even know who the enemy was. But then, Clint remembered something, the badge. The one he'd taken from the agent back at the courthouse. The one that had made that smug judge break into a cold sweat. Clint's hand moved to his waistband, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of the USSS badge. He pulled it out and held it up, his gaze steely. We're going to find out who's hunting us. And we're going to make them regret it. Tommy's eyes widened. You've got to be kidding me. Clint didn't waste any more time. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, his mind already calculating the risk. He didn't have the luxury of being cautious anymore. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant walking straight into the fire. Clint slammed the truck into gear, the engine roaring to life. His foot hit the accelerator, and the truck sped down the narrow dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust in their wake. But Clint knew they wouldn't have much of a head start. Whoever was tracking them was coming, and they were coming fast. We need to lose them, Clint muttered, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. And we need to do it now. Tommy's grip on the door tightened as he glanced over his shoulder. How the hell do you plan on doing that? Clint didn't answer. His eyes locked onto the road ahead. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get them to safety, to find cover, to move faster. But he also knew that whoever was chasing them would have eyes everywhere. The walls were closing in, and he was running out of time. "Hold on," Clint said, his voice a growl. He swerved the truck around a bend, narrowly avoiding a tree. The engine roared again as Clint floored the gas pedal, the truck shooting down the winding road with a speed that made Tommy's stomach flip. "Clint, stop!" Tommy shouted, panic evident in his voice. "We need a plan, not a death wish." But Clint was beyond listening. The sound of approaching vehicles in the distance was getting louder, too loud. His mind raced, calculating the angles, the risks, the way out. There was no turning back now. There was only forward. The truck barreled down the dark, twisting road, the headlights cutting through the night like twin beams of hope. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. The sound of the engine filled the air, drowning out everything else. He wasn't sure what was more terrifying, being chased by people who knew everything about him, or the feeling of being completely out of control. In the distance, the faint hum of sirens reached his ears. It was distant but unmistakable, something far too familiar. The realization hit Clint like a punch to the gut. They were not just being followed by anyone. This was bigger than a simple pursuit. It was an operation. Clint swerved around another bend, narrowly avoiding a rock that jutted out from the side of the road. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But the truth was, there wasn't one. Not unless he made some serious choices, and fast. The safe house Tommy had suggested wasn't far, but Clint wasn't sure it would be enough. The people who were after them had a lot more resources than a cabin in the woods. "You need to slow down," Tommy yelled from the passenger seat, his voice laced with panic. "This is insane. We're not going to outrun them, Clint." Clint didn't answer him. He couldn't afford to. He had no time for Tommy's fear or his own doubts. Every instinct told him to keep going, to push harder. He had to lose them. He had to get ahead of whatever was coming. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, but Clint didn't have the luxury of a clear view. The only thing he could see was the rearview mirror, the flickering red and blue lights growing closer with every passing second. They were almost on top of him. They were getting closer. "I know where we're headed," Clint said, his voice flat and focused. "Keep your eyes peeled. They'll be setting up roadblocks." Tommy's face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean, roadblocks? They're not just going to let us." Clint slammed his foot harder on the gas, cutting him off. The truck lurched forward with renewed force, its tires screeching as they tore through the dirt. The engine roared with every ounce of power Clint could squeeze from it. "You'll see," Clint muttered grimly. The trees lining the road thickened as Clint pushed the truck harder, the vehicle rattling under the strain. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but even in the dim light, Clint could see it was narrowing. There was a sharp bend coming up. It was a dead end if they didn't make the turn. Tommy's breathing was shallow, and Clint could feel the panic rising in the air like a storm cloud. They were out of time, and every second was making their situation worse. He needed to get them off this road. Fast. "We can't outrun them, Clint." Tommy shouted again, louder this time, his panic creeping into his words. "Where are we going? This is insane." Clint didn't answer. He wasn't listening to him anymore. The road ahead was clear, too clear. It was too obvious. They'd be expecting him to try and cut down the road. But Clint had something else in mind. At the last possible moment, Clint yanked the wheel to the right, veering off the dirt road and cutting through the trees. The truck bounced violently over the uneven terrain, but Clint held the wheel steady, his jaw clenched in concentration. He didn't even glance at Tommy as he gripped the wheel, maneuvering the truck through the dense forest. Tommy slammed against the door, eyes wide in terror. "What are you doing?" Are you crazy? Clint's voice was cold, unyielding. They'll expect us to follow the road. They won't expect this. There was a heavy silence in the truck for a few moments, broken only by the sound of the engine and the creaking of branches as the truck tore through the underbrush. Clint had no idea where this path would lead, but the sound of tires skidding over rocks and dirt had one thing going for it: it bought them time. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the people chasing them were far more prepared than he could ever anticipate. They weren't just chasing him, they were hunting him. And no matter how fast he ran, he knew they wouldn't stop until they had him. "Clint, look out!" Tommy shouted. Clint's eyes shot forward just in time to see a thick tree trunk coming at them like a freight train. Without a second to spare, Clint slammed the wheel to the left. The truck lurched violently, throwing both of them against their seatbelts, and the wheels screamed as they slid sideways. For a terrifying second, it seemed as though they would flip over, but Clint somehow managed to regain control just in time. The truck slid to a stop just a few inches away from the tree. His heart was pounding in his ears as he forced himself to breathe. "Are you trying to get us killed?" Tommy yelled, his voice shaking. Clint's eyes locked onto the rearview mirror. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder, but it wasn't just one car anymore. It was a fleet. "We don't have time to argue," Clint snapped, his voice terse. "They're here." Before Tommy could react, Clint floored the gas pedal again. The truck surged forward, hurtling through the trees. Clint's thoughts were a blur as he focused on keeping the truck moving, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back. The trees parted just slightly ahead, and Clint saw an open clearing, a small, narrow pass between two hills. It wasn't much of a road, but it was something. It was their only shot. He steered the truck toward it, his hands shaking with adrenaline, but the sounds of the vehicles behind them were deafening now. They were getting closer. They were almost on top of them. "Clint, this is it. We're not getting out of this." Tommy was practically screaming now, his voice breaking. Clint didn't respond. He had no more words to give. He didn't need them. His foot slammed on the gas once again as the truck plunged into the clearing. The tires kicked up dirt and debris as the trees thinned, but ahead, Clint could see it, the edge of the clearing, and beyond it, the road. But as they neared the exit, Clint's stomach dropped. A large, dark vehicle, black as night, pulled into their path. It was blocking their only exit. There was nowhere left to run. Clint's foot slammed on the brakes, but the truck skidded helplessly on the loose gravel, its tires spinning wildly in place. The black vehicle blocking their exit sat ominously in front of them like an immovable wall. The sound of the engine screeching was deafening, but in the tense silence that followed, all Clint could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper in the thick tension. "We're done, Clint. This is it. They've got us." Clint's jaw tightened. He gripped the wheel harder, trying to steady himself, trying to think of something, anything, that could get them out of this nightmare. But as the dust settled and the world around him went silent, he knew Tommy was right. They were trapped. The truck's engine sputtered, and the headlights illuminated the black vehicle in front of them. The door opened slowly, almost deliberately, as a tall figure emerged from the shadows. Clint's breath hitched when he saw the silhouette, the unmistakable outline of a man dressed in a dark suit. A suit that made Clint's chest tighten in sudden recognition. The figure took a slow step forward, and Clint's stomach churned. It was Agent Harris, one of the men from the courthouse. But this time, there was no smug arrogance in his eyes, no taunting smile. This time, Harris looked serious, his face drawn and cold as he approached the truck. Clint's grip on the wheel slackened slightly as he forced himself to stay calm. The last time he saw Harris, the man was part of a different game, a game Clint didn't fully understand. But now, in this moment, Clint realized something even more terrifying. Harris wasn't just a cog in a system. He was a man who had been sent to do a job, and that job was to stop Clint from reaching the truth. Harris leaned into the window, his eyes locking with Clint's. "I didn't want to do this, Clint," he said, his voice low and almost sympathetic. "But now you've crossed a line. There's no going back." Clint didn't speak. He couldn't. Words would only make him sound weak, and weakness was something Clint had never been able to afford. He wasn't about to give in now. A beat of silence passed before Harris continued, his voice colder. "You've seen too much. Heard too much. And now, you're a liability." He glanced at Tommy, who was wide-eyed and trembling, before focusing his attention back on Clint. "And that's why you're not walking away from this." Clint's heart thudded in his chest. He knew what Harris meant. He could see it in the agent's eyes, the same determination that had been in the eyes of the men who'd come after him before. The difference now, though, was that Clint didn't have a choice. He wasn't just running from the truth anymore. He was facing it head-on. For the briefest of moments, Clint considered fighting back. He thought about reaching for the gun in his waistband, the one he'd held so many times before in different situations. But this wasn't the same fight. Harris wasn't just any man. He was part of a bigger machine, a force Clint wasn't sure he could stand against. The weight of the moment crashed over Clint. He wasn't going to walk away from this. No, this was the point of no return. He could feel it in his bones. His only option now was to confront the nightmare head-on. "I'm not scared of you, Harris," Clint finally spoke, his voice steady and resolute, though his pulse raced. "And I'm not walking away." A flicker of surprise crossed Harris's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. His hand reached inside his jacket, and Clint's heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment? Was Harris pulling a weapon on him? But instead, Harris pulled out something else. A file, thick, sealed, and official-looking. He held it up, letting Clint see the label marked with the unmistakable insignia of the U.S. government. "You really think you're the only one who's been playing a game?" Harris asked, his voice quieter now, almost pained. "This isn't just about you, Clint. This is much bigger than you. Bigger than me, even. But you're too deep now. I can't let you walk away. And I'm telling you right now, if you don't cooperate, things will get much worse." Clint's eyes narrowed. There was something in Harris's voice, something almost regretful. Clint didn't trust it. It was manipulation, plain and simple. But the file, it hung there in the agent's hand, tantalizingly close. "What's in the file, Harris?" Clint asked, his voice low and dangerous. Harris didn't answer immediately. He stood still, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to know, Clint. Trust me." Clint's eyes narrowed further. He had seen too many people lie and manipulate him. He had been through too much to let this man dictate the terms of his life any longer. But as he stared at Harris, a realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about fighting the agent. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter the cost. Before Clint could respond, there was a sudden, loud noise. A gunshot. The sound pierced through the tension like a crack of thunder. Tommy yelped beside him, his hands instinctively going to his ears. Clint's head whipped around, his eyes scanning the area around them, but there was no sign of where the shot had come from. Harris's face drained of color in an instant, his hand instinctively going for his own weapon. Clint's body tensed, ready for whatever came next. And then, from the darkness of the trees surrounding them, a shadow moved. Someone else was here. The gunshot echoed in Clint's ears, its sharp crack cutting through the night like a warning. He instinctively shifted into defensive mode, his eyes darting back and forth as the sound of the shot reverberated around the small clearing. Everything around him seemed to freeze, time, the world, even his heartbeat, just before everything shifted back into chaos. Tommy was still frozen in his seat, his wide eyes searching the darkness around them, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Clint couldn't afford to waste a single second. Something was coming, and he had no idea whether it was a friend or foe, but he was certain of one thing: it wasn't Harris. Not anymore. Harris, too, had gone still, his gun now drawn and pointed toward the trees. His face had drained of color, the cool composure he'd had earlier now completely gone. Clint watched him closely, noting the twitch in Harris's fingers as he adjusted his stance. Whatever had just happened, it was big. And Clint could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He needed answers. The night seemed to grow colder, and every shadow around them seemed to stretch longer and more menacing. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Clint felt it deep in his chest. He knew that whatever was coming next, he wasn't prepared for it. But he didn't have a choice. "Stay down, Clint," Tommy hissed, his voice barely audible as he ducked lower in his seat. Clint didn't listen. He was already moving, his muscles taut with readiness. He needed to get to the bottom of this. The truth was slipping away from him like sand through his fingers, and he couldn't afford to let it. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, and moved with a purpose. The first thing Clint noticed was the glint of a silenced pistol in the figure's hand. The second thing he noticed was the fact that it wasn't aimed at him, it was aimed squarely at Harris. Harris tensed, his jaw clenched, but he didn't make a move to fire. Instead, he held his ground, seemingly recognizing who it was. "Get out of the truck, Clint," the figure said, his voice low and gravelly, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Now." Clint's pulse spiked. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to resist, to run, to find some way to fight back. But he knew this man wasn't someone he could just ignore. Whoever he was, he had the power to end this game right then and there. The mysterious figure stepped forward, and Clint could now make out the details: a man, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His stance was commanding, his movements precise. He didn't look like someone Clint could defeat with mere force, this man was too calculated. "What do you want?" Clint demanded, trying to keep his voice steady, even as fear trickled down his spine. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Harris, who was still standing stiffly beside the truck. There was a brief, loaded silence that passed between them, before the stranger spoke again. "We need to talk, Clint," the man said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't have, and now you've got the attention of people who don't like it. And we need to make sure you understand the consequences." Clint's mind raced. This wasn't just another player in the game, this was the next level. Whoever he wasn't someone Clint could just reason with. He had seen enough of the way these people operated to know that this wasn't a negotiation. "Who are you?" Clint asked, his voice hardening. "What do you want with me?" The man's lips curled into something resembling a smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. "Let's just say I'm someone who can help you, or make sure you never see the light of day again. The choice is yours." Clint's stomach churned at the implications of those words. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This man had no hesitation, no care for who Clint was or what he had done. He was a part of something bigger, something Clint couldn't fully comprehend yet, but he would, one way or another. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Tommy's voice, shaking with fear, barely cut through the tension. "Clint, we need to get out of here. This is bad. Really bad." Clint didn't acknowledge Tommy's words. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not with this much on the line. The stranger's gaze turned cold again as he took a step closer. "I'm going to give you one chance, Clint. One chance to get out of this alive. But you're going to have to make a choice, and it's going to hurt." Clint's mind swirled with questions, but one thing was clear: He was on the edge of a precipice, with no way of knowing what would happen if he jumped. His survival instincts kicked in, but his resolve remained steady. He wasn't going to back down. "I don't take orders," Clint said, his voice low and defiant. "And I'm not your pawn." The stranger's eyes flickered with something, an almost imperceptible shift in his posture. Clint had made his choice. There was no going back now. "Then we have a problem," the man replied, his voice suddenly colder than before. "And you've just sealed your fate." In a flash, the man's hand shot out, his silenced pistol now aimed squarely at Clint. But before Clint could react, a loud shout cut through the air. "Wait!" Harris yelled, his voice frantic. He had lowered his gun, and for a brief moment, Clint saw the panic in his eyes. The man with the pistol froze, his grip tightening around the weapon, but he didn't lower it. "What is it?" he demanded. Harris took a step forward, hands raised. "Clint doesn't know. He doesn't understand what he's gotten into. He's a loose end, an accident. He was never supposed to get this far. We need to give him a chance to back out. Let him go." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "And why should I trust you?" Harris didn't answer right away, but Clint could see the hesitation in his stance. Whatever had brought these two men together, it wasn't over yet. "Clint," Harris finally said, his voice lower now, almost pleading, "you don't want to know the truth. It's too much." Clint's heart pounded as his mind raced. The truth. What truth? Before Clint could ask, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the tense silence. The strangers were back. They were coming. The clock was ticking. The sound of engines grew louder, growing closer with each passing second. Clint's senses sharpened as the realization hit him, whoever was arriving wasn't here to help. This was a rescue mission, a countdown to the inevitable showdown. The figure with the pistol remained calm, his eyes scanning the road as if measuring every possible escape route. Harris, still standing stiffly, glanced nervously at Clint, his face a mask of confusion and reluctance. "We don't have time for this," the stranger with the gun said, his voice cool and detached. "Your time is running out, Clint." Clint's heart beat faster. His body tensed, prepared to spring into action, but he couldn't afford a wrong move. The arrival of the new vehicles, the presence of Harris, and the gunman's cold stare, all of it added up to one thing: Clint was closer than ever to the truth, but at the same time, he was dangerously close to losing everything. The headlights from the approaching vehicles sliced through the night like the blade of a knife. Clint's stomach churned as his mind tried to piece everything together. Why now? Why this moment? His pulse raced as he considered his options. Fight? Flee? Neither seemed plausible. There were too many variables in play, and he was running out of time. Tommy whispered, his voice laced with fear, "Clint, we need to move. We can't stay here. They'll kill us." Harris, who had been silent for what felt like an eternity, stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. He was visibly shaking now. "Listen to me. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. They're not going to let you walk away." Clint's gaze shot to Harris. "I already know that. You're not the first to tell me that." The vehicles finally arrived, two black SUVs that skidded to a stop behind them, their tires kicking up gravel as they halted with an unsettling precision. The doors flung open almost simultaneously, and a group of men in black suits emerged, their faces obscured by shadows and the harsh headlights of the trucks. They were the ones who had been pulling the strings all along, the ones who had set everything in motion. One of the men, a tall figure with a sharp jawline, took a step forward. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling calmness. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long." Clint's mind raced as he tried to process everything. These men weren't just random agents, they were part of something much bigger, a shadowy force with resources, connections, and a plan that Clint could barely comprehend. They had been playing him from the beginning. But why? You don't have to do this, Clint said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his insides were churning. I'm not your enemy. I'm looking for the truth. The man with the sharp jawline gave a short, mocking laugh. The truth? You think we're all here because of your little quest for the truth? His eyes flickered briefly to the gunman, who had lowered his weapon slightly, but only just. No. You're here because you've seen things that no one else should have seen. You're here because you've crossed a line, Clint. And now, you're going to help us clean up the mess. Clint's mind was racing. Help them clean up the mess. He was starting to understand, these men weren't after him because of his actions. They were after him because he had stumbled into something far too dangerous, something bigger than any of them. They needed him to close the door on whatever had been opened. Harris spoke up again, his voice trembling. Clint, it's too late for you. They've already made their decision. The gunman was now standing beside Harris, his eyes locked on Clint with cold determination. Clint could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was no way out of this. No easy escape. It was all coming to a head now, and he had to make a choice that could change everything. Suddenly, everything seemed to slow down. The noise of the vehicles, the voices, the rushing of adrenaline in his veins, it all blurred. Clint thought back to everything that had led him here, the courthouse, the strange encounters, the threats, the files, the dangerous game he had unknowingly entered. The pieces were falling into place now, but they weren't the kind of pieces that made a whole picture. They were shards of a broken reality. A thought struck him, one that he had been avoiding all this time. Maybe there was no getting out of this. Maybe the truth wasn't something that could be uncovered. Maybe some doors, once opened, didn't have a way to close them. Clint, the man with the sharp jawline said, his voice softer now. You've been running from this your whole life. But you're standing right at the edge of it now. Everything you've been looking for, everything you've been running from, it's right here. Take it, and you can stop running. Clint's breath caught in his throat. The edge of it. The truth. This was the moment. He could take it, whatever it was, or he could walk away and live in the dark forever. But could he walk away? Could he live with himself if he didn't know the full extent of what was happening? For the first time, Clint felt the full weight of what he had done. He wasn't just fighting against these men. He wasn't just battling his past or his regrets. He was fighting for something bigger, for the truth, for the answers that had been dangling in front of him like a carrot on a string. But now, the strings had been cut. The game was over, and the truth wasn't something he could just have. Clint looked at the men surrounding him, their eyes expectant, their weapons ready. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. But one thing was certain, whatever choice he made, there was no going back. Clint, Tommy whispered again, his voice breaking through the haze of Clint's thoughts. Don't do it. This is it. If you take their offer. Clint's eyes narrowed as he turned toward Tommy, then back to the men standing before him. What if I don't? He asked, his voice steady, though his chest tightened with uncertainty. The man with the sharp jawline smile widened. Then you'll be a problem that needs to be removed. The tension in the air was unbearable. Clint felt every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, to act, to fight. But all he could do was stare at the faces before him, searching for any sign of weakness, any chink in their armor. And then, with a single motion, the world seemed to shift. A familiar sound, one Clint never expected to hear, echoed from behind them. The sudden sound from behind them, sharp, authoritative, and unmistakable, shattered the tension. It was the sound of boots crunching against gravel, the unmistakable footsteps of someone who had no intention of turning back. Clint's heart skipped a beat as the familiar figure emerged from the darkness. Clint. The voice was familiar, gruff yet welcoming. Clint didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He'd heard that voice countless times in his life, and it was the last voice he ever expected to hear tonight. Tommy looked over at Clint in stunned confusion. Who the hell is that? The man who had emerged from the shadows was none other than Agent Mark Daniels, the very same agent who had been investigating Clint for months. But this wasn't just any agent. This was a man who had been in Clint's corner in ways no one else had. He'd always been a shadow, a background player, but tonight, he was stepping forward. "You're a little late, Mark," Clint muttered, trying to keep the panic in check. "But I'm glad to see you." Mark took a step forward, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. His gaze briefly lingered on Harris and then shifted to the group of men surrounding Clint. His hand hovered near his sidearm as if considering his next move. "It's not too late, Clint," Mark said, his voice calm but urgent. "You don't need to play their game. There's still time." Clint felt a wave of relief wash over him, but only briefly. He couldn't get distracted. This was it. This was the moment when everything had to come together. Mark had always been there, in the background, keeping an eye on Clint, but now it seemed like Mark had come to offer Clint a way out. The only problem was, Clint wasn't sure he was ready to leave it all behind. "You've been digging too deep," Mark continued, stepping closer to Clint. "You've seen things you weren't supposed to see. But you can walk away from this. You don't have to be their pawn anymore." Clint's mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Walk away? Was it that simple? Was it even possible? "You want me to walk away?" Clint asked, the disbelief heavy in his tone. "After everything that's happened, you think I can just walk away?" Mark nodded, his gaze intense but understanding. "It's not about walking away from everything. It's about taking control of the pieces that are left. You've got the power to make this your choice, Clint. You've been running, trying to catch up to a truth that was designed to be hidden. But now you know, this is bigger than just you. And the truth? It'll come out, but on your terms. Not theirs." Clint's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just about running from the danger. It was about reclaiming control of his life, something he hadn't done in years. He was caught in a storm, unable to escape the gravity of his choices, but Mark was offering him something different, something Clint wasn't sure he deserved but something that could change everything. "You don't understand, Mark," Clint said, his voice a low rasp. "I've seen too much. I've already walked too far down this path. There's no turning back now." Mark's eyes softened. "You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to let them control your every move. Take a step back, Clint. There's a way out, but you have to trust that you can still make the right choice." Clint closed his eyes, allowing the weight of those words to settle in his chest. The truth had always felt like a thing he could never truly reach. But now, in this moment, it was clear, there was no way to control everything, but there was a way to take control of what mattered most. The men from the SUVs were closing in, their faces still hidden in the dark, but Clint could feel the pressure mounting. The world was still spinning out of control, but now, with Mark standing there, the fog of confusion was starting to clear. "I don't have a choice," Clint murmured, his voice full of quiet resolve. "I can't just walk away. Not after all this." Mark studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a sharp nod, he stepped back, giving Clint the space he needed. "You do have a choice," Mark said simply. "But if you want to make it, you need to act fast." Clint turned his gaze to the men surrounding him. The strangers. The ones who thought they could control everything. He had no idea what they truly wanted, or how deep this conspiracy ran. But Clint knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to let them win. "Then I guess it's time to make my choice," Clint said, his voice filled with steely determination. His eyes locked on the man with the sharp jawline, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. Clint was done being anyone's pawn. It was time to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And this time, He wasn't going to wait for someone else to move first. The man with the sharp jawline didn't flinch as Clint's eyes met his. He knew Clint was making his decision. "You don't know what you're up against," the man warned, his tone low and ominous. "You'll regret this." Clint shook his head, feeling something deep inside him shift. "I'm already regretting not doing this sooner." With a swift motion, Clint reached into his jacket, pulling out his own weapon, one he'd kept hidden for moments like this. The heavy weight of the gun felt right in his hand. His grip was steady. For the first time, Clint felt in control of the moment. The fog of confusion, of fear, began to lift as his instincts kicked in. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how this story would end. But Clint was done waiting. Done playing by someone else's rules. He pointed his weapon directly at the man with the sharp jawline, his eyes unwavering. "I'll find out the truth. No matter what." A tense silence followed, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Mark stepped back slightly, his eyes locked on Clint with an unspoken understanding. And then, the world moved again. The world around Clint seemed to move in slow motion as he stood, eyes locked on the man with the sharp jawline, his weapon steady in his hand. The tension in the air was thick, so thick that it almost felt like a physical presence, pressing in on all sides. The group of men who had surrounded him were still, their expressions hidden in the shadows, but Clint could feel their eyes on him, calculating, waiting for him to make a mistake. "You think you can control this?" The man with the sharp jawline said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're out of your depth, Clint. You're playing a game you'll never win." Clint didn't flinch. "I'm not playing anymore. I'm done following your rules." Mark, who had been standing off to the side, now moved closer. His eyes never left Clint, and Clint could see the concern etched into his features. He knew how dangerous this was, how fragile this moment could be. But there was no turning back now. "You're making a mistake," Mark warned, his voice low. "You don't know what they're capable of. They'll make sure you never see the light of day again." Clint's eyes flicked to Mark for a moment, but his resolve didn't waver. He'd spent too much of his life being pushed around, being told what to do. Tonight was different. Tonight, Clint Eastwood was calling the shots. The man with the sharp jawline took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Clint. "You're out of time. You've already made a mistake by showing up here. You've made the mistake of thinking you have a choice." Clint's heart raced as the realization hit him. The man was right. He didn't have a choice, not really. Not anymore. Every choice had already been made for him. He had been led here, pushed into this moment, and now, with the weapon in his hand and the men surrounding him, it was almost too late to turn back. But Clint wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. He wasn't going to let anyone decide his fate. He had already lost too much, too many years of his life spent running, spent playing the part of the victim, spent trying to find answers in a world full of lies. The gun felt heavy in his hand, but it was a weight he had come to understand. He wasn't holding it to kill, but to survive. This wasn't about revenge, this was about taking control of his life again. "You're wrong," Clint said, his voice steady, louder now. "I do have a choice. I've always had a choice. And this is my choice." The man with the sharp jawline didn't move, but Clint could see the shift in his eyes. The man had underestimated him. They all had. He thought Clint was just another pawn in their game. But Clint was no longer playing by their rules. With a quick movement, Clint lowered the gun slightly but kept it trained on the group. His gaze never left the man with the sharp jawline. "I've been running from the truth my whole life," Clint continued, his voice growing firmer. "But not anymore. You may think you're in control, but this ends tonight." The group of men stirred, sensing the change in the air. Mark was still standing back, his eyes locked on Clint, but there was a glimmer of something in his gaze now, something like hope, or perhaps belief. You don't have to do this, Mark said again, his voice almost pleading. But Clint shook his head, his decision final. I do. You don't understand. I've spent my whole life chasing shadows, trying to find something that made sense. I've always known there was something off, something I couldn't put my finger on. And now I know, this isn't just about me. This is bigger than me. And I'm not letting it go. The man with the sharp jawline seemed to sense Clint's resolve, and for a moment, Clint saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, doubt, perhaps. Or fear. But whatever it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The man smirked, though there was a hint of unease behind his smile. Do you think you're the first to try and take us down? He sneered. Do you think this is some grand revelation? You're just a blip in the system. A nuisance. And you'll be gone before you even realize what hit you. Clint tightened his grip on the gun. The man's words were hollow. Clint wasn't just some pawn anymore. He wasn't a nuisance. He was the storm that was going to rip through their carefully constructed walls. I'm not going anywhere, Clint said, his voice hard, unwavering. And then it happened. In a flash, the man with the sharp jawline lunged, his hand reaching for his own weapon. But Clint was faster. In an instant, he moved, pivoting with the grace of someone who had spent his life anticipating danger. He swung the gun upward, firing a shot into the air. The loud crack of the bullet echoed through the night, sending the group of men into a brief panic. For a moment, everything was still. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had taken the first step. The world had shifted, and now, he wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a player. The men hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Clint could feel the weight of their uncertainty hanging in the air. Last chance, Clint said, his voice firm and controlled. Walk away, and this doesn't have to end like this. The man with the sharp jawline sneered again, but his eyes betrayed him. Clint had thrown them off balance. And in that moment, Clint knew one thing, he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for something bigger, the truth, freedom, and the chance to finally live without fear. Make your move, Clint said. The game had changed. The silence was unbearable. Clint's pulse thudded in his ears, the faint buzz of adrenaline still coursing through him. The men surrounding him shifted, each of them uncertain, their hands twitching slightly as if to reach for their weapons, but none of them dared to make a move. It was as if the very air had frozen, every breath held in anticipation. Clint had thrown down the gauntlet, and now, it was time for them to decide whether they would pick it up or walk away. The man with the sharp jawline sneered, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across his face. But it was the way his eyes flickered that told Clint everything he needed to know, this wasn't going according to their plan. Clint had disrupted something they thought was foolproof. I'm done playing games, Clint said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying edge. I've come too far to be intimidated now. The sharp-jawed man narrowed his eyes. You think you're in control, don't you? You think you can just walk in here, threaten us, and walk out? Do you even know who you're dealing with? Clint didn't flinch. I know exactly who you are. I know what you've been doing. And I'm done running. If you want to keep hiding behind your lies, that's your problem. But I'm done being part of it. The man's smirk faltered. You're playing a dangerous game. You think you know everything, but you're only scratching the surface. There are forces here you can't even comprehend, Clint. People with power that you've never seen, people who will make sure you disappear before you can even blink. Clint's grip tightened on his weapon. Maybe it's time I learn about those forces. Because you're right, I don't know everything. But I'm going to find out. The air between them crackled, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The man's eyes flicked to the others in the group, each of them still and silent. Clint could sense their uncertainty, their hesitation. They weren't sure what their next move should be. Mark, standing off to the side, had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Clint could feel the weight of his gaze, the understanding that this was the moment of truth. They were no longer on the same team. Clint had just crossed a line, one that no one in this world had ever dared to cross before, not without consequences. "You're digging yourself a grave, Clint," the man with the sharp jawline said, his tone cold now, the mockery gone. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Clint took a step forward, never taking his eyes off the man. "I don't need your warnings. I need the truth." Before the man could respond, the sound of tires skidding across gravel echoed in the distance, sharp and sudden. Clint's attention snapped toward the sound. The men surrounding him tensed, their hands now instinctively going to their weapons, but Clint knew something was different. Something had shifted. The headlights of several vehicles appeared, cutting through the darkness, drawing closer. Clint could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This was not a coincidence. Whoever was in those vehicles wasn't part of the group surrounding him now. The sharp-jawed man cursed under his breath, his eyes darting toward the approaching lights. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, almost to himself. "We weren't supposed to be discovered." Clint didn't wait for him to finish. He moved swiftly, his instincts taking over. The vehicles were almost upon them, their presence a looming threat, but Clint knew one thing: this was his chance. The chaos in front of him was his opening. He glanced at Mark, who was standing off to the side, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Mark seemed to sense Clint's resolve. There was no more hesitation now. The pieces were falling into place. The vehicles came to a screeching halt, and figures emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes visible in the harsh light of the headlights. They moved with purpose, and Clint could see the unmistakable uniforms of law enforcement officers, agents with the power to make everything crumble in an instant. The sharp-jawed man's eyes widened. "No," he whispered, his face draining of color. "No, it can't be. They weren't supposed to find us." But Clint wasn't watching the man anymore. His eyes were fixed on the agents, who were now approaching swiftly. He had no idea how they had found him, or if this was part of the larger plan, but one thing was clear: the tides had turned. The chaos that had surrounded him was about to reach a boiling point. "Clint Eastwood," one of the agents called out, his voice loud and commanding. "You're under arrest." Clint felt a rush of disbelief flood over him. Arrest? After everything that had happened? After all the danger, the lies, the betrayals? They were arresting him. But then it all made sense. This wasn't the end, this was a new beginning. The agents who had arrived weren't just here for him. They were here to dismantle the network that had controlled everything behind the scenes. They were the force Clint had been waiting for, the key to unlocking the truth that had been buried for so long. The sharp-jawed man sneered. "You think they'll save you? They'll bury you with us." Clint didn't look at him. His eyes were on the agents now, on the possibility of escape and freedom. He wasn't going to play by anyone's rules anymore. "I think," Clint said slowly, his voice unwavering, "they've come for you." Before the man could react, the agents closed in, their movements swift and practiced. The men who had surrounded Clint, who had once thought they were in control, were now being handcuffed and led away, their arrogance stripped away in the face of the law. Clint stood still, watching it unfold, the chaos swirling around him. He could feel the adrenaline slowly starting to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the beginning of something new. He had taken control of his destiny. And now, it was time to face the consequences. Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the world swirling in a cacophony of confusion, the law enforcement agents surrounding him like a shield. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but now, it wasn't from fear. It was from the overwhelming sense of realization: he had finally broken free, or so he thought. The agents were efficient, moving with precision as they cuffed the men who had once been his enemies. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over yet. He was still surrounded by shadows, forces bigger than him, more powerful than he could fully comprehend. The sharp-jawed man, though now handcuffed and subdued, had made one thing clear: this was only a fraction of what Clint was up against. As Clint was approached by one of the agents, a tall, stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, he tried to maintain his composure. Her gaze flickered to him as she reached for her handcuffs, pausing for just a second. "Clint Eastwood?" she asked, her voice neutral but laced with a sense of recognition. "You've caused quite the stir." Clint nodded, trying to keep the frustration from seeping into his voice. "It's not exactly how I planned it." She gave him a sharp look. "I'm Agent Harper. And we're going to need to talk." Clint's thoughts raced. Talk? What exactly did they know? Were they truly on his side, or was this just another trap? After everything he had been through, he wasn't sure who to trust anymore. But one thing was certain: the truth was out there, and he needed to find it before it slipped through his fingers. Agent Harper led Clint toward one of the vehicles, and as they moved, Clint noticed the subdued looks on the faces of the men around him. They were still processing what had happened. One of them, Mark, was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed, a wary look on his face. Clint gave him a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken bond that had been formed between them during the chaos. Mark had been with him every step of the way, and despite their differences, Clint knew he couldn't have made it this far without him. As they reached the car, Harper motioned for Clint to sit in the back. "Get in. We have a lot to discuss." Clint hesitated. "I don't know if I can trust you." Harper's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no malice in her gaze. "Trust is earned. And right now, we're your best shot at getting out of this alive. So get in the car, and we'll talk." Clint's eyes flicked back to Mark, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement. He knew it was a risk, but Clint had been taking risks his whole life. And right now, he didn't have any other choice. Clint slid into the back seat of the car, the door shutting with a soft thud behind him. Harper climbed into the front seat, her eyes locking with Clint's in the rearview mirror. "We're on the same side, for now," she said. "But that's only because we have a common enemy." Clint's brow furrowed. "I'm listening." Harper's voice dropped to a low whisper, as though she were revealing a secret. "You've been playing into their hands, Clint. You think this is over because we've taken a few of them down. But it's not. They've been pulling the strings from the start. The people you're up against, they're much bigger than just the men you saw tonight." Clint felt a chill run down his spine. The sharp-jawed man's words echoed in his mind: "You think you know everything, but you're only scratching the surface." Harper continued, her tone grim. "They've been operating in the shadows for years, Clint. And the moment you stepped into this, you became a target. They have eyes everywhere, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. If we don't move fast, you'll be dead before you even know it." Clint's jaw tightened. "So, what's the plan? What do you want from me?" Harper glanced over her shoulder, her expression hardening. "We need your help to take them down. You've seen things they don't want anyone to know. You have information they'll do anything to keep buried. But we can't do it alone. We need you to help us get the rest of the pieces." Clint stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. They needed him. He was the key. But could he trust her? Could he trust anyone anymore? "I'm not your pawn," Clint said, his voice low. "I don't work for anyone but myself." Harper's lips twitched in what could have been a smile, but it was gone too quickly for Clint to decipher. "I get it. But right now, your best shot at survival is to work with us. You can walk away, but you'll be running for the rest of your life. Or you can help us take them down, and maybe, just maybe, you can get your life back." Clint's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. The people he had been up against were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now, in this fragile moment, he was faced with a choice that could change everything. He wasn't sure who he could trust, but the enemy was clear. And if they wanted to take him down, they were going to have to fight him first. As the car sped off into the night, Clint sat back, the weight of his decision hanging heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he had made the right choice, but there was no going back now. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Clint knew that whatever happened next, it would be the beginning of the end. The end of what? Clint couldn't say for sure. But the truth, he was getting closer to it. And whatever came next, he would be ready. The car sped through the darkened streets, the hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. Clint sat in the back, staring out the window, his thoughts racing. The truth he had been chasing for so long now seemed within his grasp, yet the closer he got to it, the more he felt like he was being drawn into a web far beyond his control. Agent Harper sat in the front seat, her eyes scanning the road, but Clint could see the tension in her posture. She was no longer the stoic law enforcer who had first approached him. She was something else now, a person caught in a much larger game than she had let on. After what seemed like an eternity, the car slowed and turned into a dimly lit parking garage. The low hum of fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the vehicle came to a stop. Clint's heart rate quickened, the moment of truth was near. "Get out," Harper ordered, her voice crisp and businesslike. "We're here." Clint followed her instructions, sliding out of the car with his mind whirling. The garage was eerily quiet, empty except for a few parked cars, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Harper led the way, her pace quick, and Clint matched her stride. He could sense the urgency in the air. They moved through the maze of concrete and metal, stopping at a secured door in the far corner of the garage. Harper swiped a card, and the door clicked open with a low hiss. She gestured for Clint to enter, but he hesitated, his instincts kicking in. "Where are we?" Clint asked, his voice steady but laced with caution. "A safe house," Harper replied, her tone not giving much away. "It's a temporary location for when things go sideways. It's secure. For now, we talk." Clint stepped inside, the dim lighting revealing a small, sparse room, just a table, a few chairs, and a monitor in the corner. Nothing fancy, just the basics. And yet, Clint could feel the weight of what was happening. Harper closed the door behind them, locking it with a click. She took a deep breath, turning to face Clint, her eyes locked onto his. "This is it, Clint," she said, her voice low. "We've got one shot at this, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They're watching us. They always have been. But this is our chance to take them down." Clint crossed his arms, leaning against the table. "Who exactly are they, Harper? You keep talking about them like they're some shadowy figures. But who are we really up against?" Harper didn't flinch. "You're right to ask. But the answer is more complicated than you might think. You're not just up against some criminals. You're up against a network, people in high places, in the government, in corporate boardrooms. This goes all the way to the top, Clint. The kind of power that could bury you before you even know it." Clint let out a slow breath, taking in the enormity of what she was saying. This wasn't just about taking down a few bad actors. This was about dismantling a whole system, a structure built on corruption and control. Harper's gaze softened, just for a moment. "I know this is a lot to take in. But you've already seen the tip of the iceberg. Those people you tangled with? They were pawns in a much larger game. You're a piece of this puzzle now, Clint. And if you want to make it out alive, you need to finish it." Clint was silent for a moment, his mind turning over her words. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risks were immeasurable. But there was no turning back now. He had already sacrificed too much to walk away. "So what's the plan?" Clint asked, his voice steady. Harper took a seat at the table, typing rapidly on the keyboard of the nearby computer. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of documents and images. "We've got intel. Not much, but enough to make a move. There's a meeting happening tomorrow, high level. The people behind this entire operation will be there, and we need to be ready." Clint leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents on the screen. He recognized some of the names, powerful figures, people whose faces were plastered across the media. But what were they all doing together? "The meeting's a cover," Harper continued, "but it's where they're finalizing their next move. It's where they'll decide who lives and who dies. If we hit them there, we can take out the key players, cripple their entire operation." Clint's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the final confrontation. One shot to end it all. "Sounds too good to be true," Clint muttered. "What's the catch?" Harper's eyes darkened. "The catch is that they'll have their own security, and it's not just your average bodyguards. We're talking about elite operatives, people who are as dangerous as they are smart. You'll need to be prepared for anything." Clint's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. This wasn't just about taking down the men who had tried to control him, this was about taking down the entire system. The stakes had never been higher, but Clint had never been one to back down from a fight. "We'll need backup," Clint said, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll bring Mark. He's not a part of this, but he's the only one I trust." Harper hesitated. "Mark's a liability. He's too close to the situation." Clint's eyes hardened. "He's in this with me. He's the one who's been with me from the start. I'm not leaving him behind." Harper sighed, clearly frustrated, but she didn't argue further. "Fine. But if anything goes wrong, you'll be the first one I hold responsible." Clint didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, walking toward the window and staring out into the night. The final confrontation was looming, and there was no more room for hesitation. This was the moment he had been working toward for so long. The fight wasn't over yet, but Clint knew one thing for sure, this was his last chance to take control of his destiny. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?